thing, risk radar. Second thing, the Fed analysis. Two-parter here this afternoon. Firstly, looking at where we've been going. Bonds have generally been the most important trend. Yields lower. That's why the green light's been on bonds now for some time. The dollar catching a little bit of a bid today. Still seems to be somewhat of a two-way trade. Now, for stocks and risk assets, there's been a big difference between crypto and stocks. Crypto's had the red light for a while because the trend has been so negative. Today, trying to wake up suggests maybe we will go full on risk on. However, the stock red light may be frustrating, and if you're tuning in for the first time, you're like, what's wrong with this guy? Today we're testing all-time highs, not on a closing basis, but why the red light? Number one, I've said this is a binary situation, basically, and the market really changed in the last about 3 sessions. The binary situation basically was if the Fed has to go for the right or wrong reasons. The market has decided, it seems like basically since Nick Timiraos' article on Friday, that the Fed can go 50 for the right reasons, and I do think the logic is most compelling for the 50. So the binary situation for stocks is if we break above the range. And technically, we're still dabbling with it. The S&P 500 had the intraday high, but as soon as we make the high, we break out through the range for the S&P, and then combined with the breakout in the NASDAQ from its sideways triangle, that's when the green light goes on. There's not going to be any yellow. It's going to go red. It's going to go green. Look at the chart for the NASDAQ firstly. This is really important because the overall turmoil within the market is kind of still there a little bit between the Russell and the NASDAQ trade. The fact that we still arguably are getting the lower high since the high on July 10th, by the way, literally 24 hours later is when the green light came off stock. So it was basically right at the high for the NASDAQ. As we see NVIDIA still fighting with 120, that still is keeping me alert to the possibility that the NASDAQ could be in a downtrend. And if the NASDAQ is in a downtrend, that's going to make any kind of uptrend in the S&P a little bit more sluggish. Something I've also talked about, I think, is a healthy market, participation and breadth, but it's going to be a sluggish market. So the green light will go on when the NASDAQ gets out of that trend and the S&P gets out of its range. Now let's talk about the Fed. This is a really fun one because for the first time, pretty much since I've been covering markets post-Great Financial Crisis, the market does not have the Fed chair nailed down to a decision the day before. Few things now. For the case for 50, which I do think has become more compelling, but not necessarily from the economic standpoint. Primarily, my argument here is that it's what is best for Powell, and the logic is most compelling for 50 if you are Powell. Firstly, the economic case. It's debatable, but the case is not hard for 50. It's very simple. The chart that you're looking at, the red shaded areas, are recessions. One of those lines is the unemployment rate. The other line is the 10s to the 2s. The white line is the 10s to the 2s. The blue is the unemployment rate. When the unemployment rate turns up, aka ignites the SOM rule, at the same time that the 10s to the 2s and the yield curve generally are uninverting, that is when you are close to recession. So basically, if I'm Powell, all you got to do is point to that chart, and that justifies cutting number one, especially combined with how much inflation has slowed down. So we absolutely should be cutting. In the case for 50, you could argue, well, if the tool actually works, then you should swing it as hard as you can to have the biggest effect. That means doing 50. That way you actually maybe don't have to cut as much later on, and you have a real impact on the economy. So those points argue in favor of Powell. But the most important one here is the timing of this event, and also when you're thinking about the potential for your legacy. You have to factor in a non-zero element of the political cycle right now when one party is saying that the Fed chair will be removed and replaced, even though technically they shouldn't be able to do it immediately. Who knows what's possible? So if you're Powell and you have gotten the soft landing sufficient so far, inflation's come down the way it has, you want to try and lock that all in, pull the brake on the plane, officially land it soft so that you can say, I pulled the lever that I had in front of me, I did the best that I could. And Nick Timiraos in his tweet thread today talks about regret minimization being the case for 50. Regret minimization is the concept from which machine learning was derived and how game theory optimal poker works. The game theory optimal move for Powell is to minimize his regret by going 50. See you tomorrow.